Well, it's very interesting to be in the third, because when I was putting my presentation together, I thought I have all kinds of special moments in my life, but after seeing the other two girls, I have to realize we share a lot of the same. Maybe slightly different, so I'm just only going to tell about slight differences. I'm a girl from Rotterdam. Hello, Amsterdam. And I was not living in one of these buildings you see here. I was actually living on a barge like this. And this is called a Rhine barge, a Rijnschip for Dutch-speaking people. And I lived on this barge with my family. And this was one of the barges my parents owned. And they actually took over this profession already from their grandparents. So from both sides, they all were in the same business. And it's a bit like being a truck driver, but then on water. So they owned a barge like this. So here in the back you see the captain's hut. So here's where my father was steering the ship. Here on the back you see we had a little house because we lived permanently on the barge. And here on the front you see another little house that was for the sailor men that helped my father on the ship. Living on a ship like this is quite different from anything others. Of course, for me it's very normal, but you have to be aware you live somehow on an island. I mean, for some of you who spoke before me said, when I go onto a sailing boat, I feel freedom. For me, it was exactly the other way around. You know, this barge was very nice, had nice moments, but it was also very, you know, I was seeking for contact with land. But anyway, I grew up here, and I basically grew up in these kind of environments. You know, the Port of Rotterdam, which is massive in scale. And also the scale difference. So as you can see, this is like a Rhine barge. And then you see the height of these enormous sea vessels. And sometimes these ships we were next to this, let's say, sea barge. And then you had this kind of ladder hanging on the side where you had to climb up in order to get to land. And it was really scary, and it was kind of a wall of like 30 meters tall. But anyway, this was the environment. And of course, there were also very romantic moments, you know, and of course, this is absolutely not sustainable what I'm going to say now, but I can tell you the twinkling lights of the petrochemical industry in Rotterdam at night was fantastic. It was like fairy tale land. And I loved it. I can't say that anymore, but maybe only tonight. But you know, I lived on this barge full-time until I was 7. And of course, it was quite lonely. You know, you had, my only friends were my brothers, and there were 3 men, so sometimes they annoyed the hell out of me. And I wanted to do things, and I was somehow, I think, quite creative already from a young age. And when I was 5, I got this sewing machine from my parents for Christmas. And on this sewing machine, I started sewing clothes for dolls, etc. And I also started designing clothes for dolls. And then I started designing clothes for myself, etc., etc. So that is a bit, I think, where I started realizing that making things, designing things, I like. And that was a bit the offspring. Now, of course, the issue is, of course, when you are growing up on a barge like this and you need education, you can't have that on the barge. I mean, you have to understand this was not a digital time at all. There were no computers, no cell phones, so nothing. So I was sent to boarding school when I was 7. And of course, this was a very brand new boarding school. I think when I got there, it just opened. And of course, it was positioned right here in front of this enormous port. This is the Waalhaven in Rotterdam. And what was interesting about this boarding school was that it was a boarding school that opened in the 70s. And that was a time where the thinking about education was very different from the thinking about education in, let's say, the more traditional boarding schools in the UK or in Hong Kong or in America. This was really a boarding school where, you know, we called them leaders. So we had women and men who took care of us, and they were hippies, you know. They were smoking joints, they had henna in their hair, we were listening to Bob Dylan, you know. That was a bit the environment I was growing up into in this boarding school. And yeah, so that is how I grew up. And also what was very different from this particular boarding school compared to others is that education was not part of this boarding school. Education, you could actually choose your own school. So it was just a place to be and to stay and be taken and get fed and sleep, etc. All these kind of things. Anyway, these are some images. Oops, something goes wrong here. Yeah, I got it. So you see the architecture of 70s, a lot of bricks on the inside, but you also see, look, we had quite some. And this is a bit how I grew up. We had groups of kids. Each group had maximum 18 kids, of which 9 boys and 9 girls. And it was mixed. That was already also quite modern. And we had a lot of fun together. Of course, I don't have any pictures of all the naughty things we did. I only have this kind of very sweet pictures, but I can tell you we had a lot of fun. And we did so many illegal things. I mean, you can't even do that at home with your parents, you know. They would correct you all the time. And what I really loved about boarding school was there were just simple rules. Get up at that time, eat at that time, go to bed that time, and that was it. But there was no moral correction on you. So basically, let's say, when we talk about developing your character, that was left to you. There was no parent who told you, no, you can't wear makeup when you're 12, or you cannot wear that because you will look, you know, won't fit in our society. And I think that was quite special about this time for me, because I realized afterwards that I really started thinking what I really want already at a very early age. Anyway, so it's called Robbenoord. It's also a very fantastic name. It's like, anyway. This was the school bus. You know, when we were very young, of course, we had to go to primary school, and that had to, of course, be secure, etc. And this was our school bus. This was the main entrance. And my primary school was in Pendrecht. You know, Pendrecht, CM World, Broek, Van de Broek and Bakema. Actually, only Bakema. Sorry, only Van de Broek. It's the other way around. Anyway, doesn't matter. Anyway, this is the kind of environment where I went to primary school. And this was, of course, quite famous at that time, because this whole project was based on, you know, this SIAM thinking about making, we called it stamps at that time, you know. So he tried to create neighborhoods where you had different scales of housing so that all generations and all age groups can live together in this. And this stamp was basically multiplied. And inside these stamps, of course, you had also schools, because that's part of it. And the school I went to looked like this, basically. And then, of course, I had to go to secondary school. And when I had to go to secondary school, it was already clear for me that I lived in a boarding school with children who had parents that all had the same profession. And I somehow had this feeling, I need to break out of this. So my parents found this secondary school, which was actually a very posh school, so for me a bit of a weird surroundings. And that's this school, it's a Rotterdam Montessori Lyceum. So it was not only a posh school, but it was also a school, let's say, with Montessori education. So it was quite free. You know, I got a lot of freedom as a student to do whatever I want, which we of course did. But the funny thing is that this building was designed by Van der Broek and Bakema. So I somehow realized by putting this presentation together that I'm a small CM girl. Anyway, this was the building. So here you see the images. It was really a school designed for Montessori education. That means all the classrooms had glass, everybody could see each other. There was no such a thing as concentrating in one room. There was space for performances. We also got a lot of freedom to make performances. I was already then, of course, linking up with other creative people in the school. So we did cultural evenings, drawing. I mean, we did the most crazy thing in the school. A lot of movable walls also in the school, as you see here, quite simple. So this was the auditorium with the stage, and then you had this kind of movable walls so that this space could be used in a multifunctional way. We had no space actually to play outside, we just were a bit on the street. And yeah, this was the building. It was also funny, I found actually this sculpture, of course, I looked at every day when I went to school, but it's called the sculpture of the free bird, and it was actually commissioned by Van der Broek and Bakema to somehow make a translation into a sculpture what Montessori education should be. Anyway. And then the next Van der Broek and Bakema, yes. So anyway, I somehow never really thought I would become an architect. I was always interested in doing something creative, but I think it could have gone anyway. I could have been a fashion designer or a furniture designer or architect. I mean, it just went how it went. However, on secondary school, I found out that I really enjoyed mathematics. Mathematics was something creative for me, but I could play with rhythms, etc., and just put different types of rhythms together, and then you almost get a new kind of result. And that in combination with my drive to basically do something creative led somehow to architecture. Don't ask me why, I just at a certain point thought, okay, architecture, I go and have a look at it at school, and I just picked it. I didn't know anything about architecture. You know, nobody taught me anything about architecture, except I knew how the living room of my parents looked, but that was about it, and I just started. And I think what was really funny about, you know, so then I also looked a little bit into it. So these are some sketches from Van der Broek and Bakema on this building. And it felt so at home when I started in this building, because I was so used to this Montessori building, and it was so Van der Broek and Bakema. And here again, I was in this building, you know, it's all about working together, looking at each other, voids, connection. So here you see some of his sketches, and here on the left you see a section through the building, which I thought was quite interesting with these double height spaces, but also this kind of entressols where you look onto each other. Now, I can tell you, and these are some photos from the building when it just opened, or it was just finished. I can tell you we did spend most of the time at this entrance hall. Actually, we didn't go much to lectures at all. We were just sitting here, and I couldn't find a picture of that time because we were just debating too much. But we were just sitting here some complete days from 9 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock in the afternoon, just discussing architecture. As funny as that. Anyway, I finished my study somehow, and I started my first job in Holland, and I started applying for a job, even in your office, and also in other offices. And I got a few jobs, and then I thought, God, this country is so small, it's so narrow-minded, I have to escape. So at a certain point, you know, I wanted to go to the UK, but the UK was in economic turmoil, and at that, just 2 years before I decided to go to Berlin basically the wall came down. So Berlin was really the center in Europe where everything was happening, where you had to go being an architect. Now, that's where we went. And I'm just showing you this picture because, of course, Berlin is a city with a very strong and hefty history. Here you see the wall. Here you see the Rijnstraat, where I worked on later on. And here you see the office where I working on this project. So the way I worked in this city was so, let's say, on both sides of the wall, you could say. Now, this happened. It was quite exciting. And then I left to Berlin. I worked first for a smaller Berlin office. And then later on, I started working for Foster. And that building I just showed you, so the wall was here, as I showed you before. And this building was where the office was of Foster in Berlin, and we were working on this project, and in the meantime, it was, of course, draped. And this building we were working in was really an ecstasy building. So we had like double doors between rooms, and they were completely upholstered in order to create sound insulation between rooms. So it was actually quite amazing that I incurred that in my life. Anyway, this was the end product. Dem Deutsche Volke, still there. And, but it was an amazing time, I have to say. I mean, this is, of course, I show architecture, but the most exciting thing about being in Berlin was not so much the architecture. It was really a time where all the economies were going down in Europe. Young architects all came to Berlin. I mean, I think at that time in the UK, architects were working in restaurants because they couldn't even find a job. That's how bad it was. And we came all together in Berlin. And we were working in offices with 10 different nationalities. We even had people in the office who didn't speak French, German, or English. And we somehow communicated by, I don't know, pens, etc., etc. That was for me really the amazing part. I really learned that by working so multinational, I would say, in a team, that your approach on life, not only on life, but also on architecture, changes dramatically. Anyway, at a certain point, I got pregnant. And then I thought, I want to go home. Don't ask me why. There is no rational explanation for it. I was just emotional. I think that's what you get, emotional, when you get pregnant. I just wanted to go home. So I went back to Holland. And then, of course, I was working in this Foster office, totally organized. Nice to learn, but of course, you know, you had this kind of design rules like you cannot have more than 3 materials touching each other in a corner. And grays, we have 10 shades of grays and we have 10 shades of blue, and that's how you make the building. So anyway, I came back to Holland with this baby. The baby was actually born in Holland. And some friends of us were working at OMA, and he said, yeah, they're looking for people at OMA. I was a bit like, no, I don't think that's possible anymore. I have a baby now. I need a job from 9 to 5. No crazy offices anymore for me. I did apply in a few offices in Holland, but I just couldn't stand it. I mean, the interview was so terrible, and it was so Dutch. It's all of that what I wanted to escape when I went to Berlin. So at a certain point I thought, okay, if this is my life, I better stop architecture because I don't want to continue this. Then I did go to OMA. I had an interview that took a full day with Rem. And I thought, I'm just gonna do it. I'm just gonna see how it works out. If it doesn't work out being a mother, then I leave, and otherwise I just stay. And for me, I'm not allowed to show architecture, but I'm not showing architecture. What was for me very important, I was able to go back to an office of conceptual architecture where the boundaries pushed on a daily basis. It can't go as mad, you know, anything goes. We can test anything, etc. And of course, I learned a lot at Foster. I think it was a nice in-between stop in my life to learn to be organized, etc., and all these kind of things. But working really in this way, you know, trying to do new things, trying to be conceptually, pushing the boundaries, doing the things you think are impossible, that is what really, you know, that's really the thing I like. And what you see on the screen, that is typical, the environment I was thrown into. The graveyard, we call this. It's basically 1,000 options on one concept. But anyway, that's what I went in. And this is how we worked. Models, making things. And the first project I worked on was Universal Studios in LA. And the reason why I really like to work here are these kind of diagrams. Universal was bought by Seagrams, you know, family making whiskey, and this is how we represented architecture. And for example, this is how we represented architecture. This building had 4 towers. This was the executive tower, so that's about money. This was the God, I still have to think, it's a long time ago. Oh, the community tower, so this is all the vertical circulation. And then this was the creative tower. So this is what I really liked and loved to think. And then doing this kind of things, man-high models, you know, trying to capture architecture. And then this was, of course, in an American environment. There was also a bit of a culture clash. We had a local architect at that time. And at a certain point, he said to me, "You are making French drawings." I was a bit like, what the fuck do you know about the French drawing? And he was this really American architect who thought only in boxes, and we had to work like that, and otherwise we would not be accepted. So it was quite a weird experience, to be honest, to work on this project, not so much just from architecture, but just from a cultural point of view. So we had this local architect in LA, we were sitting in Rotterdam, trying to be international, but also Dutch, of course, at the same time. And that led to some kind of, led also to interesting architecture at the point. I remember that we had to house a lot of executives because, you know, in America, in these companies, they have a lot of CEOs, etc. And we found out that in these contracts of the executives, it was a right to have a corner office. But you can imagine, in this building, we didn't have enough corners for all these executives. So we made a zigzag facade. So we had a facade with a lot of corners, and that's where we housed all the executives. I mean, yeah, this is fun. This is encountering architecture. And yeah, that is, I think, what I like about this profession. The last project I want to show you is not this project, but it's just after this project, I got a project in Portugal. And Portugal is, of course, the south of Europe. It's a completely different culture. It's more Latin, etc., etc. And that was such an incredible experience to encounter such a different culture. You know, where I remember, you know, people are a lot more emotional in the south. So for an architect, that is actually quite pleasant, you know, because I think our drive is emotions at the end. You know, we all try to be very Dutch and say we are rational, but at the end of the day, it comes all down to emotion. So that is a nice link I felt with this culture. But there were also other moments in this culture where I felt, holy shit, what is going on? So at a certain point, I had a meeting with my structure engineer, who was Portuguese, the client, and me. And at a certain point, they started screaming for half an hour in Portuguese. And I didn't understand a word of it. And after half an hour, I was like, holy shit, now we have really a problem with this client. So I asked our structure engineer, so what's wrong? He said, no, it's all fine, we can move on now. So this is actually really the project where I also learned I can be emotional as a person. And, you know, I can also be emotional towards clients. It's fine to show that. And I think also emotion helps you. It helps you in connecting with your client. Of course, in the north, it can only be to a certain extent, because otherwise they classify you being crazy. In the south, you can use it a bit more. But to be honest, after this, of course, I did many other things, but the things I showed you and the increments in my life, I think were for me the most important things that made me who I am now. And that's it.
Thank you, Ellen, for the nice presentation. It's really nice to hear from you how your path was. What do you consider your biggest achievement?
Yeah, actually, to be honest, I never think about that. I'm quite an adventurous girl, so whatever I think is interesting, I'm just doing. I don't even think about consequences, risks, and all these kind of things we have to think about these days. I just jump from one thing to another. Whatever is interesting, I'm doing. So if you ask me what is your biggest achievement, I can't tell you. Because it is a sequence, it's a kind of adventure for me.
You had your thoughts on joining OMA at that time. I think it was a right decision as you keep so passionate about your work. What is that makes you joy of going every day to the office?
I think what for me is really nice about this environment is that we have a lot of nationalities working together. It's quite a large office, which I like, because with a larger office I can do more than with a small office. And no idea is too crazy. And what I really like is also not only different nationalities, but also different ages. You know, I really enjoy having young people around me. I'm meanwhile already very old. Anyway, sometimes I have to say I'm a bit old, I don't really get this, but anyway. But that is what I like. And that I can do things. I can try out things. And sometimes people come to you with an idea where, I mean, a normal person who would be very experienced would say, "No, you can't do that. No, I tried this out before, that's really not possible." But we are then thinking, let's try. And that keeps me going.
And you have explained one situation where they were screaming at each other and so on, and we were thinking, okay, whoa, let's see what happens. I guess it was such a list of meaningful and big projects around the world that you have had many stressful situations. I would like to ask you, how do you deal with the stress?
Well, I mean, stressful. I'm not even sure if it was that stressful. Of course, everybody has stress moments. But it was, I remember the first time I had to go to Beijing to negotiate this contract for this CCTV tower that we won. That was, I think, the weirdest moment in my life ever, because I was quite used to deal with other cultures. But at that time, in 2006, the difference between Europe and China, from a culture point of view, was so enormous. I remember we were sitting in the meeting room we were with 3 people and they were with 45. It was like a parliament, and they had second rows. And we were talking for a week, and after this 1 week, they didn't know what we said and we didn't know what they said. Yeah, that is funny, but it took us a week to somehow find a language, not only on our side, but also on their side, a language to use in order so that we would understand each other. And then, so after a week, we had to then, that was the starting point. And that was not stressful, but it was quite extreme. I mean, I never encountered something like this in my life. And then the Chinese are the best negotiators in the world. They were actually terrible. I mean, we negotiated through the night. I don't know, it was so crazy. And after that, I thought, okay, anything I'm going to do after this, culture-wise, it's going to be easy. And it was. It was really one of the hardest things I did. But it was also very special, I have to say, because I think I stayed there 3 months, not continuously, but in increments of 2 weeks and then a week back. But at the end of these 3 months, despite the harsh tone sometimes on the table, because Chinese people can be really, really harsh, I made a lot of friends somehow on the table, and we didn't even really speak each other's language. That is also quite special, you know. So that was a very special moment, I think.
And maybe one last question for this interview. What will you never compromise in order to get a project built?
I don't like compromises. And that is a really I did a project in Denmark, and then the Danish society is built on compromises, the whole culture. So this project was a nightmare for me.
No.
Because the client thought, you know, the architect has an idea and I come and sit and we meet somewhere in the middle. But I didn't want to meet in the middle because I just wanted to do what I wanted. So that was quite,
also
difficult.
Intense.
So compromise, I never compromise. I must say that critique is very important because I think critique also makes me think twice. And critique sometimes also, quite often I have to say, leads to better solutions. And I really like critique. I think we critique each other a lot. In the current time frame in schools, it's not allowed anymore because it's quite quickly framed as being harassment. But anyway, I like critique. I like openness. I think that makes us developing and trying new things and inventing new things. It's this kind of, I like this harshness. It's not personal, but it's just like, you know, you need some fireworks now and then to wake up.
It is nice that you were mentioning that about the school, that the talks were, the classes were inside and you were outside debating and being critic to each other, I guess, and having conversations. So it's nice to see that has been.
Yeah, it's still the case. It's still the case. You could also say I didn't change a bit since then.
Well, I don't know. I hope so. But that has continued, and that's very nice. Ellen, thank you for the presentation, and we are going to have in a minute roundtable discussion. So thank you a lot.
Thank you too.